Armenia has made the big jump. The big jump that people have been talking about. Are they going to do? Are they willing to do? Do they feel the security to do? And if they were to do it, could they set up another security support system fast enough to support themselves? But it's come. It's here. Armenia has officially decided to quit Russia's military alliance, CSTO. Now, this was a long time coming. Armenia has a very long conflict with Azerbaijan that goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the Armenians, to put it lightly, curb-stomped the Azerbaijani military and took land in Nagorno-Karabakh, which has a historically Armenian community there, and integrated it within Armenia, as well as a bunch of other territory. And then I think it was back in 2019, or maybe it was 2022. I forget the exact timeline. Sorry, I've been distracted by this war. I don't think it was 2022. I think it was 2019. There was an uptick, a surge violence, and the Azerbaijanis, after building up their armed forces, after having a population explosion in comparison to Armenia's basically stagnant population, and not increased investment into the armed forces, as the Azerbaijani economy exploded, they were able to use both Israeli and Turkish provided weapons, drones, to smash the Armenian military, take a bunch of territory, and claim it back to them. And this territory is largely, at the time, the territory we're talking about, is internationally recognized as Azerbaijani territory, due to the fact that, due to the breakup of the Soviet Union and how the war went, the Armenians got a bunch of land that isn't under international law considered theirs, but a lot of people there consider it Armenia. But Azerbaijanis smash them, take this land, and then a ceasefire is signed, which has Nagorno-Karabakh basically surrounded. And over the next few years, this enclave of Armenians gets strangled by the Azerbaijani military. They stage fake environmental protests at checkpoints to stop the inflow of food, medicine, water, and other essential goods for life. And they continue to make threats, bombastic threats, against not only the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, but also Armenia proper. And then eventually they pulled the trigger on a military operation, and within 48 to 72 hours, it was over. The defense forces of Nagorno-Karabakh surrendered, and they pulled out. Civilians, almost all of them, left. Azerbaijan came in. A lot of their soldiers engaged in very gruesome behavior. The Azerbaijani military is known for being very brutal, engaging in torture, beheadings, all the sort of stuff that you would not like to see in the armed forces. They fired randomly into civilian homes in Nagorno-Karabakh, and then they took it over. They renamed everything Armenian, Azerbaijani. They had a big military parade. They had a big, circus in Nagorno-Karabakh, and they've started to demolish like the old parliament and replace it with a new building. And they're basically erasing what was once a thriving Armenian community in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, internationally, this did not really get much of a reaction, in large part because the international community still sees the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh as Azerbaijani territory. So many of them did not want to seem hypocritical when it came to other wars or other issues where their territorial integrity could be questioned, whether it be the Spanish and the Catalonians or in other countries where they want to keep the state together and they don't want to be seen as hypocritical on this. A lot of them, it's because Turkey is allies with Azerbaijan. They have they believe they have like a common ethnic line, kind of. The Azerbaijanis and the Turks kind of consider themselves, the Turkic peoples. They're strong allies, and if you're an ally of Turkey, then by extension, you're kind of an ally with Azerbaijan. Some of them didn't want to piss them off because of that. Others just didn't think the Armenians had a good chance, so backing them up didn't seem like a good bet. Now, during this process, during this pressure that was continuing to be pushed on Armenia, and let me just make clear, the Azerbaijanis continue to make more demands, including demands on territory in Armenia that is only internationally recognized as Armenian territory. So to be clear, the Azerbaijanis are not necessarily going to stop where the internationally recognized borders of Azerbaijan lay. There's a tiny bit of Azerbaijan behind Armenia, and it's divided by a strip of land that is recognized internationally as Armenia. And the Azerbaijanis have been very open that they are willing to conquer it and take it by force, even though it's internationally recognized as Armenia. they would not be able to use the same justification to move in, but they've been very open about the fact they're willing to do that. They want to use their military and economic and population advantage that they've developed over the last 20, 30 years in order to get a combination of vengeance, territorial claims, etc. Now, while this was all going on, the Armenians were supposed to have a power broker in their corner, and that is the Russians. The Russians were able to get peacekeepers into Armenia, not only for their own strategic interests, because then they can have troops deployed in the region, which helps their strategic interests, but also they were supposed to, in return for that, defend the Armenians against aggression. And it was the Russians, usually, once this violence flared up, that would come in and quickly try to stamp it out. But they didn't really put a lot of effort into it in recent years, and they basically just kind of held back, even when the Azerbaijanis bombed FSB officers and bombed, and in some instances even killed Russian peacekeepers in Armenia. That did not get a strong response from the Russian government. The Russian government basically, to make a long story short, to be blunt about it, took it on the chin, kept rolling, kept going. Now, you can talk about like that from a humiliation angle. You can talk about it from a bunch of stuff. But from my perspective, it could be a few things. It could, number one, be them trying to have a good relationship with the Azerbaijanis. It could, number two, be that they do not like the relationship that Armenia is trying to develop with much of the West. It could be, number three, in large part because Armenia didn't really have fantastic chances in this war, but it could also be, and I think this is, the elephant in the room, the Russian government has a gigantic security crisis that it's created for itself by invading Ukraine. And by invading Ukraine, they've had to dedicate so many soldiers, tanks, missiles, air defense systems, jets, and all the resources that go with it, ammunition and etc., fuel. And they have lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the process. They've lost tons and tons of tanks, tons and tons of BTRs, tons and tons of equipment, and they're stretching themselves thin. Now, Russia is also the largest country in the world, and so it needs to be able to govern and keep connected this gigantic country through rail lines, through airplanes, and through having an armed forces that can go somewhere, say like Dagestan, if things start to go a little crazy again, so they could tamper it out, put out the fires and embers that can raise up into rebellion. For example, when Lukashenko's regime was threatened after a botched rigging of an election, which had him very clearly winning a majority of votes that he had not won, and giant protests then spiraled out of control from at least the Belarusian government's perspective, the Russian government sent in troops, killed the protesters, and the protesters either fled, a lot of civil activists fled, I know the opposition fled, and they were able to help enshrine Lukashenko's power. This is also where Lukashenko lost a lot of his leverage with the Russians, because his historical balancing act was, hey, the Russians are being too mean to me, West, let's talk together, let's be friendly, haha. And then the West would start making demands of Belarus, like on free elections, stuff like that. And then Belarus would lean back over the Russians and say, oh my God, what was I saying? We are the brotherly peoples and yada, yada, yada. And then they would go back and forth, a balancing act of sorts, kind of like Tito did between the Soviet Union and the United States. Maybe not as skillfully as Tito. Obviously, there's some nuances and differences here, but you guys get the point. But at that moment, he lost a lot of leverage, which he only regained once the Russians invaded Ukraine, and their strategic position then became of immense value to the Russians. And so now they've been subsidizing Belarus in many ways. But the Russians sent in troops to put that down. They need troops available for potential future security crises. And it's not just Belarus. Kazakhstan had a massive protest movement like a few years ago. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, because the government shut down oil subsidies, which meant there was going to be a rising in oil prices and the cost of gas and fuel for everyday Kazakhs. And that led to a massive protest movement. People got on horseback and chased down government troops, detained and took prisoners. They were trying to take cities. And it was only when the Russians sent in troops and once again brutally put down the protests that the protest movement backed down, and the Russians had dealt with the security crisis while also reasserting their leverage and diplomatic power over the Kazakhs. Now, Kazakhstan has largely been against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's even provided aid to the Ukrainians. And that seems to be the perspective of most Kazakhs, because they probably remember the period where the Soviet authorities were very repressive towards the Kazakh people during the 1930s, where they executed a ton of people, killed a lot of the opposition, and dominated the country. And so they probably have some sympathy with the position that the Ukrainians are placed in. But my general point here is that the Russians also need troops available for other potential security crises, not only in these countries, but also at home. We all saw what happened with the Wagner mutiny as they marched on the capital. They were shooting down Russian jets, massive crisis. So they need other troops available. And so if they were to actually get in a showdown with Azerbaijan over Armenia, that could mean they would have to dedicate tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of troops to a war they don't really have much personal benefit in. They don't really have much personal interest in. All of their interest is merely through the defense commitment to Armenia, which is not their priority when they're invading Ukraine and trying to rebuild empire. And so, when the Azerbaijanis put the pressure on, when the Russians were a little distracted, the Russians did nothing, even when their soldiers died, and the Armenians felt the consequences of that. So this was all very, very devastating for the relationship. And in response to that, Armenia continued to build its relationship with the United States, with many other NATO countries. They did a few training missions. But what I think the real final nail in the coffin for sure was, or one of the, I would say, if it's not the final nail in the coffin, then certainly as he was walking out the door, like the last time the Armenians got spit in the face of, was this report by Politico. This bombshell report, which shows from leaked files that Belarus, under Lukashenko, provided Azerbaijan with weapons, which they then used against Armenia, even though Belarus and Armenia, at the time, now not as of 6 days ago, but at the time, were in the same military alliance. This would be the equivalent of France providing weapons to a country fighting Germany, or about to invade Germany, while both being members of NATO. This is a wild betrayal. Belarus delivered advanced weapon systems to Armenia's arch enemy, even though both countries were supposedly allies in a Russian-led international defense pact, according to leaked documents seen by Politico. The cache of files shed new light on Armenia's decision this week to announce it will be leaving the military alliance, a dramatic turn that will weaken Russian President Vladimir Putin's authority within former Soviet nations. And remember, President Vladimir Putin's justification for invading Ukraine at the start, one of his many justifications was that it was a former Soviet country, and Russia, in large part, has claims to basically the entirety of the Soviet sphere. Armenia is now on the verge of making a historic tilt towards the West, increasingly looking towards Europe and NATO for protection after decades in which the former Soviet Republic relied on Moscow. Armenia has been locked in a bitter conflict with Azerbaijan. We've already talked about this, yeah. The decision by Belarus, a staunch ally of Russia, to supply advanced military hardware to Azerbaijan between 2018 and 2022, giving it the upper hand in a spat of wars with its long-standing rival, will have been regarded as a bitter betrayal by Armenia. Both Belarus and Armenia are members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, a post-Soviet military alliance led by Moscow and formed in 2002. Theoretically, members are obliged to defend each other if attacked. Azerbaijan quit a precursor to the bloc in 1999. On Wednesday, the Armenian Prime Minister, now this is the interesting part, all of this is interesting, but this is particularly interesting. The Armenian Prime Minister announced his government would begin the process of withdrawing from the bloc, claiming it were not fulfilling their contractual obligations, but are planning a war against us with Azerbaijan, saying its members helped plan a war against Armenia. Now a cache of more than a dozen letters, diplomatic notes, bills of sale, and export passports seen by Politico. I mean, that evidence is overwhelming. Bills of sale shows that Belarus actively aided Azerbaijan's armed forces between 2018 and 2022 as tensions peaked with Armenia. The services offered include modernizing older artillery equipment, which they used heavily during the attacks on Armenia, including shelling in Armenia proper against international law, and in violation of ceasefire agreements, and provided new gear used for electronic warfare and drone systems. The documents included letters from Belarusian state arms export agencies to its own military industrial firms relating to orders of the state-of-the-art artillery targeting equipment for Azerbaijan, as well as correspondence between the two states agreeing on the purchase of Grozna-S counter-drone mobile warfare stations for Azerbaijan's forces. Neither the Azerbaijani nor Belarusian governments responded to requests for comment. Now, obviously, this is a massive betrayal. These are two countries that at the time were in the same alliance as Armenia was trying to prepare for a potential war. And they were seeing the military budget of the Azerbaijanis increasing. They were seeing them buy Israeli gear, seeing them buy Turkish gear, and now apparently buying Belarusian gear within their own alliance structure. If they can't even trust their allies not to sell weapons to their enemies, which would then be used against them, how could they trust them to come to their defense, which the Russians did not do? I remember I was talking about this on Twitter, and somebody said the distinction of like, wait a second. Didn't Armenia agree to give up Nagorno-Karabakh? Why would Russia fight a war over Nagorno-Karabakh? Number one, that's in large part because they knew the Russians would not back them up. But number two, it's not only Nagorno-Karabakh. It's also been inside Russia, Armenia proper, but is internationally recognized as Armenia, and they're threatening and bombing inside of Armenia proper. So you can't really just claim that. And this goes a long way past just, oh, well, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to come and defend this if you don't even want to claim it, really. This is your alliance undermining its own protection. Because if they were to abide by the laws of the alliance, Armenia attacked, the most likely country to attack them is Azerbaijan. If it is attacked, Russia and the rest of the countries have to come to their defense. That means Belarus selling weapons to a country that they would then technically be at war with, since Azerbaijan is always going to be the number one likely culprit to go to war with Armenia due to their history, due to the ethnic tension, to a whole bunch of stuff. So it would be selling weapons to an ally you would then have to an enemy of an ally you would have to go and defend in one of these scenarios, which then puts into question if Belarus would ever have come to Armenia's defense. And this is something that the Armenian prime minister, of course, was wondering when he went to the press and said very clearly, and actually I don't know if it was the press, I think it was to the Armenian parliament, and he said, I will never, ever, ever visit the Belarusians again until Lukashenko is gone. So, I mean, the Belarusian-Armenian relationship is dead for all intents and purposes, which is not particularly surprising considering the details. If Russia can't keep Belarus under control, then that makes me question how much authority they have in this alliance. If they did allow it, then it makes me question how much dedication Russia ever had really protecting Armenia, if they're willing to sell weapons or allow the sale of weapons from within the alliance to Armenia's enemies, if Russia knew about it. And three, what consequences will Belarus get from this? Absolutely none, especially since they have increased leverage due to the war in Ukraine and their strategically important position. Meaning, if Armenia was to stay in CSTO, they would be staying within an alliance that not only did not come to their defense, even after their own soldiers were killed in Armenia proper as peacekeepers, but also would be staying within an alliance where its members had been sending weapons to its main enemy. Once you have this full context, Armenia leaving the alliance almost seems like elementary school level theory that you're dealing with here. Not that hard to figure out. Whether or not Armenia will be able to leverage support from the West enough to defend itself is a totally different question, especially since the Turks are strong allies with the Azerbaijanis and the Turks are in NATO. I am an Aborigine tribesman fighting in the bush still against the Australian colonization.